Phil Murphy here alongside ESPN combat sports reporter Marc Raimondi. And Marc, the massive news to drop Friday, we'll go in kind of ascending order. Darrick Minner cut from the UFC. James Krause's license revoked in Nevada. He's been banned from all UFC events. And the big news, anybody affiliated with he in the gym at which he coaches, Glory MMA, as long as they train at Glory MMA, not allowed to compete in the UFC. This all fallout from a probe into some shady number movement surrounding a fight in which Darrick Minner lost. How did we get here?
That's a great question. That is the question, right, Phil? So you mentioned that fight between Darrick Minner and Shailan Nurdanbeek. That happened on November 5th. There was a UFC fight night card at the UFC Apex. In the hours leading into that fight, there was some heavy betting, some heavy bets placed on Nurdanbeek to win the fight, to win in the first round, and there were also bets coming in on the under as far as how long the fight would last, ending in the first round. And the line went from somewhere in the minus 200s to somewhere in the minus 400s. It's a huge movement of that line. That was the first kind of domino to fall, the first thing that had people kind of scratching their heads. Then the fight happened, and in the first round of the fight, Darrick Minner came forward through a left kick with his left leg to the body of Nurdanbeek. Minner, as soon as he threw the kick, seemed to injure himself, or maybe he had a pre-existing injury. He kind of like bent down and tried to grab the leg and grimaced. And then Nurdanbeek came forward. Minner threw the left leg again in a kick, and essentially at that point he just covered up. Nurdanbeek came forward and finished the fight via TKO pretty quickly. So the combination of that line movement, Phil, and how that fight looked, where it looked like it was an injury, or at least something that was possibly happened that before the fight that perhaps people knew about leading into the fight, has now prompted several investigations from different jurisdictions. Multiple sports books reported suspicious betting activity to U.S. Integrity, which is a Las Vegas-based betting firm. And that is kind of where all of this started. And of course, you mentioned James Krause, who is a key figure in this. He is the coach of Darrick Minner, and he was in the corner that day. On top of that, James Krause is also someone who ran his own Discord. He charged people to bet with him, to use his picks, and he had his own betting podcast. So he is at the center of this, as well as the person who was Minner's coach and was also heavily involved in the MMA gambling world. Want to just add one more thing, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about all of this, but in October the UFC sent out a memo to fighters and their team saying, hey, look, there's no more betting. If you're a fighter, if you're a coach, if you're a team member of a UFC fighter, you cannot bet on UFC fights. And it's crazy that just a few weeks after that, this happened, and now there are multiple investigations. This whole situation with James Krause, like you said, suspended in Nevada, and there's been other things too. New Jersey is not taking any bets on James Krause related fights. Ontario, the province in Canada, has banned betting on the UFC pending these investigations. And Alberta on Friday followed suit, joining Ontario as a place where you can't bet on UFC fights in Ontario and Alberta now in Canada, which is pretty huge for a major sport to have these things happen.
Yeah, and it's not just MMA. It's not an MMA ban. It is a ban on UFC betting in those Canadian provinces, which directly points, it seems, to the fallout from these allegations against Krause. Marc, I want to hammer home the fact that no Krause fighters are allowed to compete in the UFC. It does not affect Marcelo Rojo, who's fighting Saturday in Orlando, thankfully for him. But David Onama, Jeff Molina have fights coming up in January. Brandon Moreno's fighting for a title at a pay-per-view in Rio on the 21st of January. What are they expected to do? What can and can't they do going forward to stay within the bounds of what the UFC is now allowing in terms of disassociation from Krause?
What I was told, and what the UFC statement that was released on Friday conveyed, is that any fighter who is being coached or involved with Krause in any way, trains at Glory MMA and Lee Summit, Missouri, any fighter like that is being advised by the UFC to, at this point, disassociate with James Krause until these investigations are up. So one would have to imagine that Brandon Moreno will not be training with James Krause for his training camp for a very big fight, main event of UFC 283 on January 21st against Davison Figueiredo to unify the UFC flyweight title.
Yeah, these are fights 6-7 weeks out. So the assumption is these guys are well into their camps and they have to pivot. Marc, what does the next chapter of this story look like in your best estimation? Where does this go from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think that one thing that we have to look at is if other jurisdictions join Ontario and Alberta in banning betting on UFC fights. Now, one would have to imagine that what the UFC did as far as banning fighters from being associated with Krause, at least temporarily, that might alleviate some concerns among gaming commissions across the country and across, the world. So that might be a step in the right direction as far as that. I know Ontario told, ESPN's David Purdom today that as long as the UFC can make, I think the word they used was like remedial changes, or at least remedial steps to, improve and to be able to enforce the integrity of the sport, that UFC betting will be back on in Ontario. So maybe this is a step in that direction. And then as far as James Krause goes, Phil, these investigations are still ongoing. We really don't know, what they're looking at, if it goes beyond just this fight with Minner and Nerdonbeek. James Krause is a very, active coach. He's, look, I mean, some would say he's one of the better coaches in MMA. A lot of Moreno just joined him earlier this year. He left his gym in Tijuana to go train with James Krause, because a lot of people, if you ask a lot of fighters who train with James Krause, he's a very good coach. So it's just a very fluid, I guess you could say, situation. And there's a lot more that needs to come out potentially about these investigations. And hey, maybe at the end of the investigations, we return back to business as normal. But right now it's a very strange time for the UFC and for the sport of MMA.
Yeah, it does seem there are further significant developments ahead. Of course, follow all of Marc's brilliant work on his social media and on ESPN.com/MMA, and keep up with ESPN MMA's YouTube channel for all the latest. For Marc Raimondi, I'm Phil Murphy. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.